Okay, so today we're going to be just doing some multi-step equations. We're going to do a few, and if you are watching the video and taking some really good notes, you'll notice that we are actually doing the first two problems and problem number 4 of your classwork. So that's 3 problems in class that you don't have to do if you're watching the video and taking some really good notes. So our Common Core Learning Standard today is E8, EE7A, and B. We're going to be using inverse operations to solve multi-step equations, but we will be beginning with using our distributive property. So your objective for today is going to be, I will use distributive property to solve multi-step equations. We've already worked on inverse operations for our 2 steps, so we're going to add a distributive property for our multi-step equations today. And yes, that is my dog. I am at home recording this. She is noisy. Go ahead and pause right now, copy down the objective for this lesson, and when you're ready, press play and we will continue with the next slide. Alright, here we go. So the first problem we're going to be using is number 1 on your worksheet that you'll have in class tomorrow, so make sure you take some really good notes so you can transfer this information onto that assignment. And reduce your workload. Do yourself a little favor here. I'm going to use blue because everything's in black already. So when we have parentheses, we have to try and get rid of what's in the inside first. But since these are not like terms, I can't combine them. So in order to remove these parentheses, I'm going to do some multiplying. This number here, and anytime we have parentheses, means -4 times the quantity of 1 plus 5r. So I'm going to use this parenthesis as a multiplication symbol, and I know I'm going to need to multiply this number by everything that is inside, or each term inside the parentheses. I have 2 terms here, and I know that because they are separated by this plus sign. So I have a -4 times 1, which is going to give me a -4. And then the second term I need to multiply is a -4 times a positive 5r. So if I'm doing my little triangle here, I have a positive and 2 negatives, right? So if I'm multiplying a negative times a positive, my answer I know is going to be negative. So my answer would be negative something. 4 times 5 is going to be 20. And that r just tags along. And then you bring down the rest of your equation. I should have drawn my line here. Make sure you guys are adding that line to help you see what is on either side of that equal sign. So this line essentially becomes your equal sign. Okay? So now I have 2 terms over here. I have a -4 and a -20r. Now I want to move the one that is not attached to my variable first. So that gives me this -4. And here's when my inverse operation, right? So inverse operation, I'm going to add the opposite. So I'm going to do a +4. And remember, I have to keep that balance, so I'm also going to do a +4 on this side. This eliminates, right, because it becomes 0, but 0 has no value, so I don't need to bring that number down. But I do need to bring this down. I need to make sure that I include my negative sign, okay? That's super important. This becomes a -20r is equal to the sum of 76 plus 4, which is 80. Okay? So now I have this multiplication. And the inverse operation here of multiplication is to divide. Right? So the inverse of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide. Remember, I have to do it to both sides. So there's my fraction bar. Make sure you're including this step. Don't do this in your head. Later on, it's going to confuse you. Make sure you're writing down every step when you're solving these problems. So I have a negative 20, so I have to divide by a negative. If I only divided by 20, this would give me a negative r. I don't want my variable to be negative. So I'm going to divide both sides by a negative 20. Once again, I'm dividing a negative or positive by a negative, so my answer will remain negative. This becomes 1. Remember, 1 is shy. So my answer is going to be a negative something. I can eliminate these zeros. 8 divided by 2 is going to be 4. All right? Make sure you have all of this copied down before we move on to the next slide. If you have to push pause, do so now and copy it down. Okay, so here we go. Now, I want you to take a look at this because in our previous problem, we had the variable on the left-hand side. This time, my variable is on the right. It does not matter what side that variable is on. In the end, we can do a switch, but we don't have to move anything to confuse us on the get-go. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring down my 155 over here because I know I'm not going to be touching that just yet. But I am going to look at my right-hand side, and I'm going to multiply negative 5 times 5n. So again, a negative times a positive. Let's do our little triangle up here. Negative and a positive gives me a negative. And it's going to be negative. 5 times 5 is 25. And my n tags along. So now my next triangle is going to be a little bit different, or the result actually, because I have a negative 5 and a negative 1. So a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive answer. So 5 times 1 is 5. Okay? So that's our distributive property. So I'm going to say distribute would be my first step here. So now I need to look at my inverse operation, and I'm going to add the opposite. Now remember, I want to look at the term that is not connected to the variable. So negative 25 is connected to n, so I'm going to look at this plus 5. The opposite would be a negative, right? So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. This becomes 0, right? I'm going to bring down, make sure you include your negative in there, our negative 25n. 155 minus 5 is a very simple 150. And now I'm left with a one-step equation where I'm going to look at my inverse again here, which is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 25. Remember, I have to make sure I use that negative because I want my answer to be positive, right? So 1n, or n, and 150 divided by 25. Now I have a positive and a negative. So that is going to give me a negative answer. And I'm thinking in terms of quarters. How many quarters is going to give me $1.50? I know 4 quarters gives me $1 and $2 gives me 50 cents. So my answer is going to be negative 6. And then if I want to, I can just change the order over here and box my answer as n equals negative 6. All right, make sure you have everything copied down. Hopefully you were able to follow along. We're going to do one more. I'd like for you to try the next one on your own. So push pause when we go over to the next screen. Try to solve it and then hit play, and I'll solve it with you, and hopefully you did what I did. Okay. Here's my problem. Please write it down. Push pause as soon as you have finished copying it. Try to solve it on your own. And then when you're ready, after you've got an answer, let's come back and check. And if you made a mistake, try and figure out where you went wrong and fix it. Okay, so I'm going to wait about 3 seconds. Make sure you're hitting the pause button. Awesome. Okay, so here I go. I have a positive 6 times a positive 1 that I need to distribute, right? First I'm going to distribute. I'll write that down. 6 times 1 gives me 6. And then I'm going to multiply my second term, 6 times a negative 3x. So positive times a negative, if we look back here, positive times a negative is going to give me a negative answer. It's going to be negative. 6 times 3 is 18. And my x tags along. Sorry, I forgot to put my little bar here. Equals, but I'm not doing anything to this side, so it's going to be negative 102. Okay, so once again, now I need to look for my inverse, right? And remember, I want to add the opposite. Whatever is not attached to my variable. Here I have 18x, so I'm going to look at this here. There's no sign in front, so that tells me this is positive. So the opposite of a positive 6 would be a negative 6, which tells me to subtract 6 from both sides. This becomes 0. That's our goal. I'm going to go ahead and bring down my negative 18x. And here I have two negatives, so I'm going to do my t-chart, or my column method here. I have a negative 102 and a negative 6. They're both on this side, which means I add them. This becomes 108. They're on my negative side, so they're both negative. I get a bigger negative, negative 108. Okay. Now this last step again is to my second inverse, right? Another inverse. I need to look at the inverse of this multiplication, which is division. So I'll put my division bar, or my fraction bar, and I want to make sure I take that negative sign with me. So I'm going to divide by negative 18, both sides. This becomes a positive 1, or 1x. I'm going to bring my x down, and then I have to figure this is also a negative divided by a negative. Okay, how do I know that? Because when I divide a negative and a negative, I get a positive. Okay. So I don't know this off the top of my head. I can't think that quickly, and maybe you can't either. So I'm going to go ahead and divide 108 by 18. So 18 can't go into 1, can't go into 10, has to go into 18. So I'm going to think this is close to 20, and this is close to 100. So I'm going to try 5. Okay, 5 times 8 is 40. 5 times 1 is 5. Plus 4 is 9. And it looks like that's going to give me an answer of 18. So I can try that again. This time I'm going to try 6, because that looks like it might work. 6 times 8 is 48. 6 times 1 is 6, plus 4 is 10, which gives me 0. So x is equal to 6. Now, if you're ever not sure that your answer is right, remember, we could always do our check. And checks are super good. So I'm going to say 6 times the quantity 1 minus 3 times 6. Oops, that's terrible. Is equal to negative 102. So I'm going to say 6 times 1 is 6. 3 times 6 is 18. So 6 times 18 is negative 108. If I add 6 and I add 6, oops, oh, that's not true. I'm sorry. Bad mommy. Bad teacher. So 6 minus 108, so I'm going to subtract 108 from, or 6 from 108, and that's going to give me 102. And my answer is correct. Okay. Don't be afraid to do a check on all of your problems if you want to be sure that you're getting them right. When we take tests and there's multiple choice ones, sometimes we can just do the guess and check. But your problems won't always be multiple choice, so it's always better to know how to do it instead of just doing the check. All right, so that's it. We'll do one. You guys can transfer 1, 2, and 4 to your worksheet tomorrow. and the rest we'll do in class. If you have any questions, please write them down in your notes and be sure to ask me about them tomorrow. Thanks. Have a good day.